welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am so excited to be here with this journalist and writer and researcher, all sorts of very interesting hats that our guest wears today, here to talk about an absolutely fascinating work of history and investigative journalism and all sorts of interesting things coming together with some history that touches on some local places. So all that being said, welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Sure. Hi, Jen. I'm Cheryl Thompson. I'm an investigative correspondent for NPR in Washington. And my book, it's my first book. It's called Forgotten Souls, The Search for the Lost Tuskegee Airmen.
I always start with a question about your career and your journey as both a journalist, as a writer here. I'm also curious about, because I know that you're also an educator, as I was before I hit libraries, teach at George Washington University. So yeah, could you talk a little bit about that journey and perhaps all those things kind of came to bear on this project?
Well, sure. I've been teaching at George Washington this is my 13th year. I can't believe it's been that long. And before that, I was at Georgetown for a bit and at Howard University, sort of all in the DC area. But I've done it alongside my journalism because I think the students really appreciate journalists who are still in the newsroom. Who are teaching them in the classroom. Not that they don't appreciate those who have been in a newsroom, but it's just something very current about it.
I'm curious about the inception point for this particular work of research that has become this book. You have a personal connection through your father. Can you talk about when you knew this was more than just an area of personal interest to you and a bigger project?
So, it's funny because this project started. So before I came to NPR 7 years ago, I spent 22 years at the Washington Post, where I was a reporter there and on the Metro desk and then on the investigative team and doing some other things. And it was a colleague of mine in 2018 who had done this fascinating story about the remains of who they believed was a Tuskegee Airman. And the remains were found over in Austria. And I thought, oh my God, like how many years had passed? Didn't even know there were missing men over there. And so the story, rightfully so, played on the front page. And I asked him, he and I were talking, and he knew about my dad, or at some point he learned about my dad being an airman. And I asked him, I said, do you think there are others who are missing? And he says, oh, yeah, there are. And so I said to him, I said, this is your book, right? Because the story was such a good story because he's a reporter who covered history. And he said, no, Cheryl, this is your book. And so that's how it started. And it still took me a couple of years after that conversation because, the thought of a book, I mean, had I considered a book, not seriously, right? Before, because I was so focused on my journalism. And it still took me a couple of years, and I thought, I could do a news story, I could write a news story, I can do an investigative piece, but a book, 70,000 words, it was a little daunting. And so I thought about it and ran it past some people. And that's how ultimately I said, you know what? If not I, who's going to do this? And so that's why, and you're right, with the connection, my dad served in World War II over in Europe and was part of that group. There were 14,000 or so Tuskegee Airmen. They weren't just pilots, but they were staff support and medics and mechanics and all types of other, and some women as well. And so that's how the book was born, was out of that conversation I had with my former colleague.
It taught me so much. And, when I even saw the title itself, when it came in the mail for me, I went, because in a weird coincidence, like when I was in grad school for history was when the movie Red Tails came out that George Lucas made. And I remembered a line in that where someone, a general, some sort of one of the characters said something like, nobody has ever in the Red Tails or in the Tuskegee Airmen has ever been shot down. And your book shows that is not true and that there is so much history that has either still is there to be uncovered or has been uncovered but not really acknowledged in systemic ways. So could you talk a little bit about that process of research and recovering all this unacknowledged history?
Yeah, there's a lot that's been written about the Tuskegee Airmen, but so much of it is inaccurate, and I'm not sure why that is. I'm sure there are myriad reasons why that is so, but these guys were very good at what they did. They weren't perfect, but they were very good pilots, and a lot of things. A lot of, movies are movies, right? They're going to embellish. They're going to, they're not going to be like 100% truthful. And so when I was starting this research, because I wasn't quite sure, what I wanted to figure out with this book, what has not been written about the Tuskegee Airmen, because there were so many things written. I thought, what's an area? And then, of course, when my colleague did that story, and I thought, well, there's missing airmen. And I didn't see a lot written about that. And so that's, that were actually had disappeared, had vanished over in Europe. And so that's why I chose that. And I thought, well, how am I going to approach this? I need to find families of these people. And I'm like, well, I don't know how to, like, who are these people? And so I enlisted the help of, I call her the best researcher in journalism, Alice Kreitz, who was my colleague for many years at the Washington Post. And I said, Alice, I've got this book, and like, would you consider, like, if I need your help on finding some people, would you help me? And she's like, oh, absolutely. And so, together we searched for these people. I searched through records. I went to the National Archives and found like just records and records and records. Now, some of the things I did run into a few issues. There was a fire, as you may or may not know, in 1973 that destroyed millions of records there. So I was up against that and hoping that none of the files of the 27 were burned. And in fact, they actually were, including my dad's. I have his records, and there are a lot of the documents are charred. And so, yeah, for proof. And I remember going to the National Archives. This was in St. Louis. It's where they keep the personnel records for these military folks. And I remember having a brief conversation with the archivist. They're saying, like no one thought to put in a sprinkler system here. And he says, no, he says, they didn't want the records to get wet. And so I thought, so you'd rather risk them being burned? And that's exactly what happened. And so in a lot of cases, the records are non-existent, and I don't know that you can ever recreate them again. But I found most of the records, and in there, I got really lucky. I tell my students that journalism is a lot about luck. And in some files, I found letters from, like in one file, there was a letter. It was a form actually from a daughter. And I didn't even know this Tuskegee Airman was married and had children. And she was looking for like his medals and his documents. And she had written to the government, and they put it in his file, and in there was her address and her phone number. So that was really helpful. And now I was like, okay, now I felt inspired, right? Because I'm like, okay, there's probably more. And there were those kinds of little things that if you kind of knew what you were looking for. In another file, there was an application for I want to say it was for a war bond, but in there was the name of this woman, and her name was Sarah White, and the airman's last name was White. And I thought, could this be his wife? But then I noticed that in the box she had checked, she had an option of Miss, MISS, or Mrs., and she checked Miss. And so I thought, oh, that's probably a sister, right? And so, I jotted that stuff down. It's like, investigative journalism I always tell my students, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. Right? It's one piece at a time. And that's what I did with these files. It was one thing at a time that led me, in the case of the Sarah White, that's a common name. And I thought, oh my God, like, Lieutenant is a more unusual name.
Yeah.
Polkinghorne is a more unusual name. Sarah White is kind of a common name, but I knew where he was from based on his file, on his personnel file. I knew that he was from Ohio. And I just started researching and found an article from a few years ago where they had named a street after him in Elyria, Ohio. So I reached out to the organization that had done this and that was in charge of this, and they put me in touch with Sarah White's daughter, who then I reached out, and that's how I got to Sarah. But what I didn't know was she had dropped the H from her name when she was in high school, so that made it even more difficult. But it was those kinds of things, and that's how I sort of, did the research. It's just like one thing led to another, one document begets another.
It is like a just, I'm not a journalist, but I was a historian. And it's so funny how that process, I wonder if it's the same way where it can be like 75% frustration and then like 25% like manic joy when you find the connection that you're
Yeah,
looking for.
I think I fluctuated, right? I vacillate. It's like I went between, some days were good, and
Yeah.
other days I go, oh my God, tell me again why I'm doing this. And, one of the other things to this, and this might just be me, but, the daunting thing about this too was, the 70,000 words. It's like I couldn't think of it like that. And it was a former editor of mine at the Washington Post who said to me, he and I were talking about it, and he says, don't think of it like that. Think of like each chapter as a magazine piece. You've done magazine pieces. So just hold on to that. And that is really one of the things that helped me get through the writing and researching and the reporting of this book, was to think of it like a magazine piece, one at a time. And it was more doable in my brain.
That's so interesting that you bring that up because one of my questions is about how well you handle um, balancing the big story with all of the little stories. And I'm really curious about how you decided on the structure, which you've talked a little bit about now. Where do you find the big story in all of the little ones? Is it easy to get lost in the weeds? Or, I mean, it feels like you have to constantly kind of change perspective from big view to little view.
Well, what's interesting, I think, about this process for me at least was, in a news story, it's like just the facts, ma'am, right? It's like it's the documents, it's the facts. In a book, for me, it was like put everything in there, throw everything in there, and then you could, sort of figure out what you got and what you need. But it was just the opposite of what I'm used to. And trust me, I was counting every word, which was insane. But also I think bigger stories emerged from the smaller stories. For instance, the airplanes that they flew. They weren't always given the best planes, these black pilots. And I was reading I was reading a report from a general that he had done like in the 70s. He oversaw these guys initially because of course they were the first black pilots, so they had no black officers. And so he kind of oversaw this group in Tuskegee initially, and he had, decades later done this report looking back on it. And one of the things he mentioned in there was how Washington, I call it the establishment, did not want these guys. They did not want them flying planes in this war. And so there was this one type of plane that Washington thought was sort of not sort of, it was a bad plane. And it had a propensity to sort of crash, and it was just not a good plane. And somebody, according to this general, said, I've got an idea. Let's send these planes to Tuskegee. And that way, we take care of our problems. We don't use the planes anymore. We got dead black pilots. Hey, problem solved. No problem solved. And so I thought, geez, did they really? And I don't know why I'm surprised by this. That was one thing that emerged. And then I know from talking to, when I started this book, Jen, there were 7 Tuskegee Airmen pilots who had flown in Europe who were still alive out of the 355 of them. And there were 7. And so I tracked down 5 of them. Well, four, let's see, 5. Yeah, 5, and then a daughter of one because her dad was sick at the time. And I remember talking to them about the planes, and they explained to me the problems that they had with the planes. Like one pilot told me his tachometer didn't work the whole time he flew. And the day he turned in his plane was the day the tachometer started working. And another one told me about how oil used to spew out of his plane onto the windshield, and it would blind him momentarily, which could, of course, could be fatal. So it was those kinds of things. And then along with the general's report, I thought, my goodness, like, what is going on with these planes? So that was one theme that emerged, were the planes. And then I looked at, of the 27, how many of them died from or went down because of a mechanical issues, and there were more than a third of them did. So that was sort of the pattern that emerged, one pattern that emerged for me.
Wow. That's another, I think, really elegant balancing act that the book does, which is balancing sort of the systemic racism in the Army and in how these pilots were trained and then utilized in the war, and the sort of individual acts of racism that they face just in social and in military, professional, personal situations. When you are talking to these people, I'm sure, you have a history of reporting on difficult subjects, but are there particular, not cautions perhaps, but are there particular ways that you approach these conversations about sensitive, difficult things like this?
Well, because I was dealing with families of these men, I mean, the men themselves, the five survivors, I spoke with, they were sort of used to talking about things. They lived it. And so they actually were very comfortable talking about the things. But also I think back and I go, this was more than 70 years ago by the time I tracked them down. And the fact that they can still recollect things, bad things, negative things, sent a message to me that they're still troubled by it.
Mhm.
Right. And no matter how tough they were as soldiers, there was still there was still that issue of how they were treated, not how they were treated on the way down to Alabama on the train. And, they had to get up and move cars when they got below the Mason-Dixon line. And, a lot of these guys were from the North and they weren't used to that Jim Crow South, right? That was really, even though in one instance, I remember the parents of one told him, he says, he was from Philadelphia, Lieutenant Colonel George Hardy, and his parents warned him. He's like, no, this is going to be you're going to experience something really different when you get down there. And, they couldn't, when they got to Tuskegee, they weren't welcome in town, even though there was a large black population in Tuskegee, they weren't welcome because the people who ran the town were white and they didn't want them there. And so they got into trouble there. And, occasionally, Benjamin O. Davis Jr., who commanded those troops there, had to go and sort of rescue them and, get them out of trouble sometimes because and there wasn't anything he wouldn't do for those men. I mean, he was very protective of his men. But there were things that they never got over, like General Charles McKee, who was one of the most probably well known of the airmen, told me the story of when and he made a career out of the military. And he told me long after World War II, and I don't recall whether it was Korea or Vietnam. I think it was Korean. Anyway, he had come back to the base and he had gone for a haircut and he walked in and sat in the barber's chair and the barber started cutting his hair and then stopped and said, "Are you colored?" And General McGee said, "Yeah." And he says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I can't cut your hair." And so, and since General McKee then, who wasn't a general at the time, but he went to the base commander and told him what happened. And the base commander found him a closet where they could send a barber and he could cut his hair. But it was those kinds of things that they remembered long after the war ended, that still sort of resonates with them.
Mm. One of the things that you talk about in the book is the high level of perfection to which these men were held. Their behavior was so much more closely scrutinized than their white counterparts. And I remember reading on your website where you have a little profile of your father that he was described as being beyond reproach, and sort of what that actually took in your day to day to maintain that level because you were held to such a higher standard of those around you.
Well, they had to have letters. I don't know if it was true for the white soldiers, but I know these men had to have so many letters in their files when they were, joining and applying for this cadet training program. And one of them was were character references. And it's funny because when I read my dad's file, I didn't know of course, I didn't know any of the people who had written these letters, but and then the base officers had found that he was beyond reproach. I mean, they did hold them to a higher standard. But the men were, they were so used to it. They were so used to being held to a higher standard. They always knew they had to be better than to succeed, or that's what they thought, because that's the way they were taught.
Mhm.
That you have to be better than. And, a lot of these guys were college educated. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them were college educated. And they came out of, good schools, University of Chicago, University of Michigan, and certainly the HBCUs, Kentucky and Virginia, and Shaw. I mean, and Talladega. They were definitely ready to handle whatever the war threw at them. It's just, nobody wanted to think that they were smart enough
Mhm.
or good enough. And then in fact, there's a report from, I want to say it's from 1929 from the War Department, as we knew it then, that basically said that the Negro was inferior, and his brain was smaller, and all of these things you just read and you just go, did really, like, was somebody drinking when they wrote this? And the answer is no, they weren't. This is what they believed.
The struggle to get where they were was so difficult, and then the lack of acknowledgement afterwards. Yeah, that lack of closure, I imagine, is why those memories are so strong and emotionally charged. Mhm.
Yeah, and I think clearly people, they wanted them to fail, right? And that's not to say all of the planes were faulty, because they weren't.
Mhm.
But a lot of times they did get the hand-me-down planes, but they wanted them to fail, and they wanted to make it as difficult as possible. It's almost like hazing in a
Mhm.
way, right? I'm a
Mhm.
sorority girl, so not that we haze, but it's sort of that ritual. It's like, okay, we're going to see how tough you really are, and if you survive it, then you know what? Maybe you do deserve to be here. And they proved them wrong many, many, many times. Those men were really resilient and steadfast. I say that in the book. They were resilient and steadfast and determined, and they were tough. They were tough. And they were tough, but they were also they were military guys, and so they always did what they were told. They followed orders, because that's what military people do.
Mm. Absolutely. And, it's this book is such a lovely contribution to and has already had immense impact on having their efforts be more recognized. Where do you see those wider efforts right now? Do you see things moving, or is there still like a lack of acknowledgement in the higher up places?
Well, no, I think things have clearly changed
Mhm.
over the 8 decades.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, it took a while for these men. It took not a while, it took a long time for these men to be recognized for their efforts, clearly. And it was really in 2007 when then President George W. Bush gathered them at the White House to give them the Congressional Medal, that I think the country really sat up and took notice and go, wait a minute, these guys were something special. And they have been recognized many times over the years. But also when they came out of the military, if they left after the war ended in 45, they couldn't get jobs. As I remember, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Stewart, who died last year at 100. I remember the conversations we had, and he said to me, when I left the military, I couldn't get a job as a commercial pilot. It didn't matter how many hours I had flown, that nobody would hire me, and the two airlines, both of which are out of business now, but one of them was Pan Am, he said, and he could not get a job. And so he went back to school, and a lot of them went back to school, and they all did quite well. But, imagine being, giving your life for this country, and wanting to do the one thing that you love, and that is to fly a plane, and then you come out right on the heels of a war that you fought for and helped win. And they say, sorry, you're still not good enough.
Yeah, incredibly frustrating. And I think you really capture that and the effect of this on their families, their literal living legacies. It's a really lovely book. And I'm curious, do you think you'll write another book? I know you're busy with your other journalism, but what do you see in your future?
I don't know. I'm sure my NPR editor goes, please, not another book. Like, um, but he's been terribly supportive, which is amazing. But I don't know. This is my first. I'm just trying to sort of like take it all in, and think about, like, okay, this worked, maybe this didn't, maybe the next time. But are you asking me if I have another book in me? Maybe. Do I have a topic? No. Because if you had asked me if I would write a book about the Tuskegee Airmen, my answer would have been no, right? Because I didn't pay attention when I was growing up, and my dad was telling these stories, and I really kicked myself for not paying closer attention. But when you're a kid, yeah, I'm a girl, got two older brothers, and I could care less about the stories he told about war. Are you kidding me? But luckily, one of my brothers kept a photo album, and it was very revealing. And I remember when I went to visit General McGee, because he lived right outside of Washington, and I took that album with me, and he went through that album like it was like a stroll down memory lane for him. And I watched him as he just, gingerly turned the yellow pages of this book, and it transported him back to that time. And it was really something else. So we'll see. We'll see.
Oh, great. Well, no pressure, but I do hope so. Because one of one of the things I loved about this book was there are just these really beautiful moments of human connection in all of this research and putting this together. And yeah, it's lovely. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and, share this with our listeners.
Oh, thank you guys for having me. And I really do owe it all to the families of these men, because without their stories, they're the ones who fill these pages of my book with their stories and their memories and their letters and it was just again, I got lucky with people who kept letters that were handed down from these soldiers to the parents, and the family saw fit to keep them. They really helped me tell their stories. And so for that, I'm forever grateful to them.
All right, listeners, well, check out these stories in Forgotten Souls, The Search for the Lost Tuskegee Airmen. It's available now as we speak. It will be available when you hear this. So head to your favorite bookstore or library website, wherever you like to go for books.
Amazon, you can go to
Amazon.
CherylWThompson.com. That's the book's website, and you can, see stuff there and find out where I'm gonna be next and what I'm gonna do next. And thank you again for having me. It was my pleasure to be here.
Oh, you're so welcome. And I'll drop that link in our show notes. Okay, thank you, listeners. It is time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.